You enjoyed the lunch. I certainly did, so thank you very much for that. Post-lunch session, we're going to get the energy levels right back up, very quickly. We've got two fantastic speakers, and just two, so we're going to be slightly less pressured than we have at some of the sessions in the morning and allow them to develop their theme in slightly more detail. So I'm moderating, as you will have gathered. I'm Paul Ekins. I'm Professor of Resources and Environmental Policy at University College London, UCL. And I'm very interested in both aspects of the double materiality that we heard about in the morning. The increasingly severe impacts of environmental issues on populations, and I just can't go through a session like this without mentioning the people of Pakistan. We cannot imagine what those guys must be going through now, and it really hurts me that we've been predicting that kind of stuff for at least 30 years and not done anything like enough to avoid it. So this is really serious business now, and I feel that we need to make sure that that's the atmosphere in which these kinds of discussions are conducted. And then obviously the notion of the impacts of these things on the business, the ridiculous attitude that seems to be emerging in some places in the United States, whereby companies have to concentrate only on their financial bottom line, and I believe a number of states are passing legislation to that effect, when any notion that climate and other environmental issues, such as we've heard earlier today, does not impact the bottom line, I mean, is simply illiterate. And I cannot imagine how anyone can be so cut off from the real world as not to realize those sorts of issues. So we've got two speakers who are going to kick off. We're going to run this so that I've asked them to speak for about 5 minutes, because we've got a little longer than some of the previous ones, just to introduce themselves and their themes. I'm going to start by asking them a question, and then they'll develop their answer to that. I may then have a follow-up question before we turn to the second speaker, and I will ask you for a clarificatory question after the first speaker. So please use Slido. I've been asked by Julia, who's the boss here, that we're going to do questions on Slido so we don't have people rushing around with microphones and all that stuff. So please use it. Please use it quickly. And I will try to be democratic and take the most voted on questions so that we know there's real interest in the room, unless a question really catches my fancy, in which case I may use chair's prerogative. And then we'll have a panel discussion, but a lot, I hope, of interaction with you to make sure that we're actually addressing the issues that you find important. So that's enough from me. I'm going to turn to my left, Kevin Massey, Vice President of Climate at Equinor, obviously major oil and gas company, going to talk about the way he addresses that particular challenge.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you to The Economist for the invitation to be with you today. Very important set of issues. I didn't join the morning meeting, but I understand there were lots of important discussions around the whole landscape of ESG and risk. The title for this session is Building a Climate Strategy for High-Risk Sectors. Equinor is an energy company, global energy company headquartered in Norway with a portfolio of businesses around the world. As Paul mentioned, a tradition and a heritage in oil and gas, but a company that's transitioning to a broad energy company, one in which we are building the world's biggest offshore wind farm in this country, Dogger Bank, where we are building a whole portfolio of wind assets, including offshore US and other major markets around the world, but also one in which we're trying to develop and de-risk and prove out the value chains of the low-carbon system for the future. And so it really is a company that is looking to build on its competitive advantage, its history and heritage in Norway, to be a positive agent for change in the energy transition. And I think when we think about this challenge of building a climate strategy for Equinor, we have been, I think, challenged to show that we have a credible strategy that is fit for purpose as we address the challenge of net zero. Equinor has a 2050 net zero goal, including all scopes of emissions, scope 1, 2, and 3. And we've seen in recent years increasing focus and interest, not just on the 2050 horizon, but on the steps to get there, particularly actions within this decade. As we know from the IPCC reports, we need to see rapid reductions in emissions by 2030 if we are going to be tracking on a Paris consistent trajectory, and particularly if we're going to be on a 1.5 degree trajectory. I was the coordinating author of Equinor's energy transition plan, which we put in front of our annual general meeting earlier this year. This was a document that is increasingly, I think, expected of listed companies to show that they have a credible strategy in the energy transition. Our plan was focused around three major dimensions. The first was reducing emissions under our control quickly. Absolute emissions reduction. And so when it comes to those emissions where we have agency, our operated emissions on scope 1 and 2, we have made a clear commitment to reduce those by 50% by 2030. This is a stretch. Will require a significant amount of capital investment, of capacity. But we see that if we are to be credible in the transition, we need to be a company that can say we are reducing our emissions, the emissions where we have control and most agency. The second part of the plan is investing at scale and rapidly in alternatives to oil and gas. And so we are, as I said, building out a huge renewable business around the world, not just wind, but primarily offshore wind, to transfer our competitive advantage in offshore operations, project management, putting steel in the water. And we're doing that through our renewables business. And the third dimension of the strategy is, as I mentioned briefly in my introduction, investing in the systemic change that we need to see for hard-to-abate sectors. And we see a huge opportunity for carbon services, carbon removals, carbon capture and storage, particularly linked to hydrogen production. And so we have an emerging business area that is making large investments and partnerships, which I think is the key word in this sector, around proving up the low-carbon value chain. That is both in Norway, where we've just signed the first cross-border commercial agreement for carbon capture with our two partners in the Northern Lights project, and here in the UK, and actually in the US as well. But here in the UK, we're building a cluster around CCS and hydrogen in the Humber region, and also partnering in the Teesside region to see how we can contribute to the decarbonisation of hard-to-abate sectors, particularly industrial clusters, with our expertise and capability. So that's the strategic focus. We also recognize that we have a role, and I think that the last few months have emphasized this and reminded us of the need for us to be a provider of secure and reliable energy. The dislocations we've seen in the market the last few months, I think, have shown the value of trusted suppliers of energy. Equinor is now the largest supplier of natural gas into Europe, which is a responsibility that we don't take lightly at a time like this. But we recognize the need for a strategy that is both one that delivers energy and continues to deliver energy over time, and one that sees a rapid transition. The way that we think about the challenge of decarbonizing the energy system is through a concept called net carbon intensity, which is one that says that Equinor will continue to be an energy company. The world needs energy. We'll continue to deliver that energy, but we'll do it in a way that ensures that energy is delivered with a lower and lower life cycle GHG footprint over time. And we have laid out a clear pathway for delivering that energy and reducing the carbon intensity of that energy over time. So our interim goal for 2030 is to reduce our net carbon intensity by 20% relative to a 2019 baseline. And then by 2035, by 40% relative to a 2019 baseline. So what that means is that every unit of energy that Equinor delivers, every megajoule, will have 40% lower GHG footprint, including from the use phase, from the Scope 3 Category 11 phase, than it did in 2019. And that's the way that we see Equinor having a credible and positive role. I think that there is a lot of focus on companies solving for net zero at the company level. And I think we need to recognize that, there are routes for individual corporate net zero that don't do a great deal for the systemic change that we need to see. In fact, actually may be counterproductive in terms of displacement of emissions through divestments and transfer of ownership. And so Equinor's focus is on its own emissions, on investing in the systemic change that we want to see, and ensuring, I think finally, an important point, that we get there with our counterparties in the value chain. So this is a challenge for companies like Equinor, absolutely, but also for our suppliers, for our customers, and for our partners, both corporate partners and government partners and civil society. So that's the way we think about the challenge. I'm happy to expand on any element of that, but I think I'll leave it there now, Paul, for the intro.
Great. That's really, really interesting and quite impressive. And obviously, we know that these transitions take time. I'd like you just to step back a bit from Equinor and the company and just answer a question which you may have been asked many times before, but it's a question that I've had. I'm writing a book on decarbonization, and I'm trying to answer this question. So I'm going to get it from the horse's mouth. The International Energy Agency did its net zero emissions pathway back in 2021, and it was very clear in that pathway that meeting the Paris targets meant that there was no more scope for new fields of coal, oil, or gas. There was enough had been discovered, and if it was produced, that would use up the carbon budget. And yet, pretty well everyone in the oil and gas sector, I think including Equinor, is still spending hundreds of millions of pounds, dollars a year on exploration in order to discover new fields, which the IEA says cannot be produced. Now, this seems to me to be a difficult one. And I just wondered, I don't want you necessarily to defend Equinor's strategy, though you can do that if you like, but I'm just wondering when we might expect an oil and gas sector that says, okay guys, been there, done that, that's the past, and now we really are going to invest in the alternatives, because obviously we want you guys to continue to be energy companies, because we all need energy. So just talk us a bit round that so that we can help understand.
I mean, it's an important question, and I'm glad that actually you raised it, because we, of course, were very aware of the NZE report that came out from the IEA. And I think it wasn't Paris aligned, it was a 1.5 degree pathway. So, I mean, of course, 1.5 is Paris aligned, but there is I think some room for interpretation around kind of the exact wording of the Paris Agreement and what is 1.5 being, the desired or kind of stretch ambition, but well below 2 degrees, obviously being the wording in the Paris Agreement. So, I think the way we see that report from the IEA is a report that said, if the world were tracking towards 1.5 degrees, then there would be no need for new investment in oil and gas, new oil and gas infrastructure or fields. So I think what the IEA did is derive a pathway to 1.5 and say, if we were on this pathway, then we wouldn't need any more oil and gas. Clearly, we're not. We're not on that pathway. And in fact, the IEA makes clear that we need, I think it's 100 million barrels of oil a day this year. They're forecasting 103 million barrels of demand next year. So I think the way that we see that and interpret that report is, if the world had organized itself in a way such that we were tracking towards 1.5 degrees, we would need no more oil and gas. The problem is we're not at all tracking towards 1.5 degrees, and therefore we do need new oil and gas. And in fact, the IEA is among one of the loudest voices calling for new investment in oil and gas now, I think in the wake of, well, even before the tragic events in Ukraine. So I think that was an interesting, I think, modeling exercise. But I think for that to be true, for us to be in the situation where we needed no more investment in new oil and gas, we would need to see demand falling off at a rate that we're not seeing at the moment. And so in the interim, the world continues to need 103 million barrels of oil a day. Who's going to be providing that? Well, I think over time, the listed Western energy companies will provide less of it because we have a strategy to transition into broader portfolio of energy themes. But I think there is still a place for investment in oil and gas, and I think we're reminded of that every day, unfortunately, in this country and around the world as we face the challenge of a market that's being dislocated and disrupted through the events in Ukraine.
Thanks very much. Right, so I said I was going to look at Slido. So here we have the top voted question is, how do you assess effectiveness and long-term effect of carbon offsets and storage, which is one of your new business areas, I think you were talking about.
Yes, you're right. We have just developed or just established a new division in our MMP organization that's looking at the carbon markets. We see a role for carbon offsets, but we see that role as having to fit very clearly into the mitigation hierarchy. And so we see a need to avoid emissions, reduce emissions. And then as a residual, I think at a corporate level, as a residual tool, we see a role for carbon offsets. When it comes to our absolute emissions reduction ambition of 50% by 2030, we made clear in making that ambition that we would use carbon offsets for up to 10% of that total. So we thought it was appropriate and important to guide in a clear way around how much of that ambition would be met, because I think there is a risk that targets and ambitions can suffer from a lack of credibility if there is not a clear kind of guiding in terms of the component that offsets will play. I think when it comes to Scope 3 emissions, there is probably a different role. And I think that there is a range, of course, and spectrum of offsets. There's nature-based solutions, there's protection, there's removals, there's technology-based removals. And so we see that there is an important and emerging kind of clarification necessary around which offsets, in which contexts, and for which durations. I think technology-based removals, of course, will be, I think, an important part of the mix over time. We're looking at several solutions in that respect. But I think through the work of organizations like the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative and the ICVCM, we're seeing kind of an emerging set of norms and standards that companies can relate to. So for us, we're trying to position ourselves in a way that will enable us to not only make use of these offsets, but also participate in that value chain. But we're also very conscious that there will be a lot of scrutiny on how these kinds of levers are applied to corporate net zero targets. And so we want to be on the right side of that. We want to make sure that we're transparent and that we focus on the highest quality use of offsets when we use them, but all in the context of a strategy that seeks to avoid and reduce as primary priorities.
Great, thank you very much. Certainly the voluntary carbon market leaves a lot to be desired from the work that I've been doing on it recently in terms of integrity and permanence, not to mention additionality. So let's hope that the integrity initiative there bears fruit. So let's turn to my second speaker, who is Laura Zitzo, co-founder and chief executive of Manifest Climate, which is, I think, one of the sponsors of this event, which is great. Thank you very much for that. And my opening question, I clean forgot to ask the opening question. You had to ask the opening question yourself. Unfortunate. But my opening question to you is, from your analysis of climate disclosures, what best practices can you share on developing and implementing a climate strategy? And these guys are going to be all ears for that, because best practice is the name of the game.
We think so too, but before I get into that, I have to respond to what we just heard, because I'm not normally on a panel with someone that's as passionate as you, Paul. I'm usually the one that brings the real talk, and so now I don't have to do that job because we are in a climate crisis, and I normally start by saying that, right? A climate crisis. We don't use that word lightly, and we forget it sometimes. We are going through the climate transformation, just like we went through the digital transformation. We're going to go through a revolution in the way we do business, and so I'm really excited about the panel calling it Building a Climate Strategy for High-Risk Sectors. But it's not just oil and gas that's high risk. It's every single company in the public markets that's high risk if we're going through an industrial revolution right now. And it's really easy to look at oil and gas and say, it's your problem, and it's not. What we just heard was the rest of us that are using that energy, it's our problem. And we like to point fingers. So it's like, okay, stop with that, and let's all say, what's our point? What's our role? What's our responsibility as we're going through the climate transformation? So I decided to do that when I went to law school. And I was part of the UNFCCC youth delegation. I'm just going to tell you a little story about how we got here and why we built Manifest Climate. Because I said, geez, this is my life. What's 2050? I'm going to be 69. So now I've aged myself, right? But I'm going to be 69 in 2050. And I was a youth delegate at Bally talking about what's the future going to look like? And I said, well, I better try my best, right? So I started my own law firm. I was working at the biggest law firm in Canada at the time. I started my own law firm, and I said, how do you be a climate lawyer? Like, how do you do that? So we were trading offsets. We were doing different things. Then I became a management consultant. How can I be a management consultant guiding my clients through this transformation? And then we realized they're asking for the same thing. They're asking for help understanding best practices, understanding how to think about this transformation from a business model perspective. They're asking for help saying, how do I stay relevant? And how do I feel like I've got my act together? So luckily, the TCFD emerged. And when the TCFD emerged for me, and I like to call Mark Carney one of the best exports from Canada after maple syrup. I'm based in Toronto. But he started the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures when he was working here as the governor of the Bank of England. Let's not forget that, right? After the pivotal speech about the tragedy of the horizon, the tragedy of the investment horizon. So how do we bring this idea of making an industrial revolution happen in 10 years that's supported by financial markets and keeping markets stable and companies investable? We try to get more, this is answering your question, we try to get more disclosure that's actually relevant. So the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, it's not a mistake that the biggest circle there is governance. I think we can learn a lot from how this is governed and how seriously organizations take governance, but it's not very well disclosed how people are actually governing this issue. Who is in charge? Is the board competent? Is management competent? Do we have clear executive compensation elements? So out of the disclosures that we review, about 60% of the best practice disclosures say that there's C-suite oversight, right? We want to see more of that. Metrics and targets. Only one of the 11 recommendations of the TCFD is about carbon emissions. And I heard this morning people saying, TCFD, carbon disclosure. It's not the same thing, right? One of the TCFD recommendations is about carbon emissions. The more pivotal recommendations are around business strategy. How are you going to navigate the transformation? What does your strategy look like? How are you integrating climate reality into your risk management processes? How are you thinking about the floods impacting your business, not just the need to reduce carbon emissions as quickly as possible? So what we've done with Manifest Climate is said, let's curate all those best practices. There's 40,000 publicly traded companies in the world. They're all thinking about this, or they should be. Let's get how they're thinking about this into one place so that we can inspire action. So we're seeing disclosure actually, I don't like it to be the tail that wags the dog. When we used to be a management consulting, it would say, help me write my TCFD report. I'd say, well, where's your strategy? They're like, oh, we don't have a strategy. Then what are you going to disclose, right? And it's this circular element. So now we can see some best practices from disclosure. We can see that companies that are taking this seriously have good governance, and that's where you start. And then we can look at all of the metrics and targets that the IASB and others are putting forward.
Yeah, so we come back to the earlier session today, which said, actually, ESG is all about G. That you can't do the E and the S without the G. What it's important is that the G takes account of the E and the S, as well as overall within the business strategy, and we had a lot about integration. I'd like just to pick up your sort of extra question. You were saying, how in this 10 years do we get the financial sector, lots of financial sector people here, actually to invest in this stuff? And it seems to me that I think is a question I know the answer to, but I want your take on it, because if the incentives are there, the finance sector will go. I mean, why is Kevin's company building the largest offshore wind farm just off the UK coast? Because there's something called contracts for difference, which have got the risk and return ratio right, and he's got the expertise, so they can do it.
Yeah.
So why can't we put similar incentives in place to get the financial sector moving at scale, at speed, in the right direction?
Yeah, I think it's just about connecting the dots about what matters, because I don't think we necessarily need new rules. We just need to this is the market, and it's changing rapidly. Like the Bank of America study that said $130 trillion going to be redeployed to help us move through the transformation. That's $130 trillion of opportunity. Right? Someone is going to get that money if we're actually going to do it. So when we thinking about disclosure for high-risk sectors, you have to think not just about the risk, but about the opportunity. Where are the new investments going to come from? How are you going to be supporting that? And then making it not just about the traditional oil and gas. I think that it's about competency in the investor community around what we mean by climate, and having a basic level of competency around this transition, and making sure it's not just the responsible investing team. I always joke about that. Like, what are the rest of them? Like, not responsible investing? So it shouldn't just be the responsible investing team and the sustainable investing team that's thinking about this. It should be a requirement of every single investor who is moving money in the market to understand we're going through this right now. And I think if there was a real understanding of that from a governance level, the incentives are there. So you can already see it in some of our clients, some of the banking community. They're now putting through a requirement for basic climate competency for every banker. And every banker now has to ask the question, does this investment or potential loan have material climate risk? And the bankers are saying, we actually don't know how to answer that question. We need to learn. So I think we're going to see this, and I don't necessarily personally think we need big policy pronouncements on it. We just need more competency and expectation of those who know how to think.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn to this again. I'll just make a quick comment about the CFDs, and you might just like to comment on this, because at current electricity prices, the contracts for difference that are being put out, not a subsidy in any sense of the word. I mean, they're actually very competitive, and the people who've got CFD contracts are currently paying back into the into the pot. I mean, can you see, Kevin, that this contract for difference idea is going to be more widely used for carbon capture and storage, perhaps, for all sorts of stuff, good stuff? I mean, it'd be fascinating to apply that idea to the nature agenda as well.
Yeah, I think it's been proven to be a great success as a policy mechanism, particularly for technologies and sectors that need to scale and that know that they can realize cost reductions through scale and deployment. I think there's an opportunity for thinking about CFDs in the context of more nuanced applications. So floating offshore wind, for example, is a technology that we're developing and pioneering. It's relatively less mature than fixed bottom applications of offshore wind, but we see the potential is there, the resource is there. And I think that there is a potential for kind of narrowing down the specific applications of CFDs. I think it's also true in the context of CCS. I think there are a lot of these solutions that we know can work if the value chain is assembled in the right way and de-risked in the right way. And so I think CFD is a great tool in the toolbox.
Thank you. Let's go then to, I was going to go to a question that has disappeared. But it was to do with a paper that, at least I've reviewed a paper on that topic, so I'm particularly interested in it, and I think it's one that both our speakers would have a take on. What's your take on a possible regulation that says that companies that put oil and gas into the market have to take back the carbon? In other words, they're responsible for the waste, i.e. the carbon emissions, as well as putting the product on the market. I know this is something that some professors at Oxford are very keen on. Let's turn to you first on that.
I'm going to be like cute first and let him do the hard talking. But I mean, did we make tobacco farmers pay for the cost of lung cancer? So we need a systemic change, and we need everyone to start taking responsibility. And yes, oil and gas companies are disproportionately powerful, and it's easy to talk about them being responsible, but they're not. We are responsible because we all buy it, and we all drive it, and we all make decisions, and we don't demand things differently. So, like, I like to use that example because those poor tobacco farmers. Right? So it's like, it's just like a different industry that has a lot of power, and of course there's been systemic issues with that power being misused to to prevent climate action, but now we are where we are. And we need to all share responsibilities of moving through this transformation, and I think every publicly traded company, every consumer, every buyer, every investor, like the question about investors being responsible, need to think about their role in this transformation. And we can't just have a small group be fully responsible.
Thanks. What would be yours? I mean, would this incentivize CCS, which you say you want to do?
Well, it's an interesting concept. I think I've seen the same paper as you on this carbon take-back obligation. I think is the idea. I mean, I think this question goes to the root of the challenge. We have an externality, which is carbon emissions, that needs to be costed. That needs to be fully reflected in business decisions, in consumer choices and preferences. And it's not. And I think when we look at the different options for kind of how to manage this, of course, a carbon price is the refrain that we hear from everybody who approaches this as an economist would, which is price what you don't want to see and get less of it. I think the challenge of the carbon take-back obligation, I think, also underlines the challenge of Scope 3 in general, and the lack of an architecture that is reliable and that can attribute emissions where they belong. I think there would be some significant logistical and kind of administrative challenges around implementing a carbon take-back obligation. What we are trying to build as Equinor with our partners in Norway at the moment, this Northern Lights project, is in effect an effort to operationalize a similar concept, which is that we will provide carbon capture and storage as a service to industrial emitters. So we'll provide, these aren't our emissions, they may be considered under some rules of counting our Scope 3 emissions, but we'll provide services for those who emit these emissions, transport and store these in permanent geological reservoirs, and provide that service. And I think that market is evolving. Of course, you need counterparties and you need rules for working out who gets the credit for the emissions saved. But I think this is emerging. I think as a blanket approach to solving the emissions challenge, it would have significant challenges.
Yeah. And thanks, Kevin. I can just add, I fully agree on the externality perspective, and we need to internalize that externality and the price in carbon. That's where I think policy pronouncements can really help to help create these markets. But I think putting it all on a small group of powerful companies is not what we need. We need regulatory change to create that market that will allow for that sort of business model switch to happen.
Well, we certainly all agree, I think, that we want carbon pricing. I've been writing about carbon pricing for 30 years, but unfortunately politicians find that particularly difficult. So we are just a couple of minutes away, and I mean, I have to take account. I wasn't going to let this session be hijacked by nuclear power, but I have to see that there's a lot of interest in nuclear power out there. So I'm going to ask my two speakers to give their opinion on nuclear power very briefly, and then we will wind up this session and go on to the next one. So,
Sure,
do you want to start?
Yes, I think that nuclear power is part of the solution. I think that nuclear power is part of the solution, and in Ontario, where I live, I can feel confident plugging in my electric vehicle at night, and it's a zero emissions charge because we have baseload nuclear power. And I think it's going to be part of the solution. I think we need to figure out how to price it properly, and I don't think we've had very good pricing. I did a whole study in law school on this, so do know a little bit about it. I don't think we've actually properly priced nuclear power, both the risks and how much it actually costs to build. But so this goes to our lack of good pricing and making economic decisions. But right now, nuclear probably has to be part of the solution.
So if it was properly priced, whatever that may mean, if it was properly priced, would it be more expensive or less expensive?
Way more expensive, and I think it would incent innovation in other forms of electricity. So I don't think we've seen the types of solutions that could be in the market because we've made a policy decision that nuclear is supported by government, so therefore we're going to invest in it. So I think we haven't actually seen the market at work for alternatives to nuclear, but that would be interesting if we did, because I think the pricing may be out of whack with how much we're seeing it be part of the solution.
Really interesting. Over to you, Kevin. Is Equinor going to become a nuclear power provider as part of your energy?
It's not in the energy transition plan as currently written. Equinor does have an investment in a fusion startup through its ventures arm, but that is a venture. I mean, I think the challenge of the transition is going to need reliable, scalable, zero emissions power generation, and nuclear delivers all of those. Of course, it does so with other challenges than the ones we've addressed so far. But I agree. I think it's got a role in the mix. I think it's going to be. I think there's going to be some challenges to work out at the margin. New nuclear, of course, we're seeing the retirement of nuclear fleets and aging fleets now. How new fleets, new assets are brought on, and the risk management assessment around that. But absolutely, I think if we don't have nuclear, the challenge is going to be a lot more daunting than it already is.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, my opinion, for what it's worth, is that and I'm fascinated, you think it would be even more expensive if we did it properly, because, I mean, it is eye-wateringly expensive.
Yeah.
In the UK, at least. I mean, we can see what happens in other countries, but, I mean, it must be at least 3 times the price of the offshore wind that's going under the CFD at the moment. 3 times.
Right.
And that's a big margin. So I struggle to see a role on economic grounds. But it depends on storage and whether we can iron out the intermittency, the variability of the renewable sources, which at present are much cheaper.
Can I make a final point?
Make a final point. You've got 1 minute, 56 seconds.
I just wanted to make a final point that we can learn from each other, and we can learn by using best practices and having alignment with the TCFD. Recall that 85% of global GDP has said they're going to mandate TCFD alignment. So there's been a lot of discussion about different standards, but TCFD alignment and SEC proposed rule, it's very aligned to that, thinking about transition planning. We can learn from each other by better disclosing and by accessing tools that can help assess disclosure and best practice, and would love to kind of chat with you more about that.
Thank you. Final thought, Kevin.
No, I mean, I think that's a great place to leave it. We can learn a lot from each other. I mean, as a company, we pride ourselves on our transparency, on our openness, and our willingness to learn. And I think we see this landscape emerging, the consolidation of different standards for reporting. We do report in accordance with TCFD guidelines. We recognize that there's going to be more of an expectation on companies to disclose their risk, whether it's transition risk or physical climate-related risk. But we think we have a strategy that's robust for the transition for ourselves, but it'll only really happen if we get the buy-in and the partnership of those throughout the value chain, and also the partners in civil society and the financial community that kind of understand the nature of the challenge, which I think is a systemic one. and one that companies in our sector can provide or can contribute positively towards. So thanks for the opportunity to be part of the conversation. Look forward to continuing.
Thank you both very much indeed. That was great.
Thank you.